Welcome to The Business. I'm Lanre Akinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. In this special edition of The Business, we're looking at change in Africa. Change in the way Africa governs itself, change in the way it does business, and change in the way Africans see themselves. Early in the series, I had the pleasure of interviewing two people who are very involved with these changes. Werner Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit. IHS have been closely watching developments across the continent, especially in the East. And Obi Asika, Chairman of Dragon Africa, who are part of the newly confident African creative industry. First, Werner, who's been keeping a particularly close eye on developments in Ethiopia. Ethiopia has announced that it's finally going to start liberalizing its economy in a meaningful way. They're opening up state-owned enterprises, including the telecom sector. Talk us through a little bit of the significance of this.
Now, this is extremely huge for Ethiopia, particularly because Ethiopia has often had a closed hand around its economy in that sense and not literally let a lot of foreign investors to come in. In telecoms, for example, Ethiopia has a population of over 100 million people. Now, that is a huge market for telecoms. And we have seen in the past regional companies like MTN or like Safaricom try to move into Ethiopia, but then the Ethiopian government has always been very reluctant to accept this. And so opening up Ethiopia's telecom sector is a huge opportunity for these companies to be able to tap into this market. It's also a good opportunity for Ethiopia to be able to attract better technology and better services into its market.
It feels like the country is moving into the next phase of its development story. It's been the fastest growing economy in Africa since the turn of the century. It's the fastest growing economy again this year, almost 9%. I think it's 8.5%. Why is this shift happening now? Is it just external pressure here? Because we know that Abiy Ahmed, the new prime minister, has come in on the back of mass protests for years and years. Is that what's really led to this big step here?
The new prime minister certainly seems like a gentleman who is in a rush to achieve a lot of things. But yes, you're right. The protests, which we saw, the Oromo protests as they're called, which have been going on since 2014, I think, have actually showed the limits of the previous government and the current system, or the previous system, I would say, given that there's a new prime minister with a new system, in terms of using a very centralized government in that sense to be able to control everything and for the government to be everywhere and to be able to take care of everything. So the limits of that system has been shown, and now the government is responding and reacting and trying to say, okay, we think we need to liberalize here and getting capital and expertise from outside to come, of course, in a staged manner in that sense, to be able to allow them not lose control significantly.
And that phased approach is very reminiscent of China. Are we looking at perhaps the one country here that might be able to emulate some of the huge success stories we've seen in Asia?
I would hope so, but they still have a tall hill to climb. If you look at Ethiopia demographically, they are extremely poor regions in that sense. And so even though we see the boom story around Addis Ababa and the infrastructure which is going on there, I think they do still have quite a journey to go in that.
It's a long road ahead, but they shouldn't struggle to attract foreign capital. It's all about how this is used to drive meaningful economic development, surely.
That's true. They certainly shouldn't struggle. And if you see, we at IHS Markit are still forecasting something like 9% growth next year. I do personally think that there's a lot more in the tank in terms of growth for Ethiopia. But then the reality here is that being able to have a total change in the way the economy is run, and by having state enterprises release their control is going to be a tough challenge and a tough sell for the economy overall, and for people to be able to see these benefits to spread in a way that people expect. So I really do hope, but would have to wait and see on that one.
Well, look, the other side of the story here is, of course, the politics. And while Ethiopia has been, as I said earlier, the fastest growing economy in Africa for some time, one of the huge question marks has always been around political reconciliation. Yes. You have the majority of the country, from an ethnic standpoint, is politically marginalized, has been for a very long time, which has been the main source of the protests. There too, we're seeing big changes. The ODF, the Oromo Democratic Front, which is an exiled opposition group, has been invited back into Addis, which would have been almost unthinkable even 12 months ago. And that is aimed at overcoming that, which one is hugely significant in terms of the economic growth, but again, evidence that this government has decided we need to move forward.
Absolutely. I think we need to give huge credit to the previous Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn for acknowledging that the system which he was running had gotten to its limits, and he was not the face of change which was needed to push it ahead. So it's already a significant change for the new Prime Minister, who comes also from the Oromo region, to be the one who is in charge. Also with respect to his background in terms of his age in that sense, and not having been a major player in the revolutionary fight, to be the one who's moving the country forward. Would have to see what the talks bring, but he has a balancing game to play also, because we have entrenched political forces in the TPLF, which still dominates the ruling coalition. So the Prime Minister has a balancing act to be able to, on the one hand, make sure he brings back a lot of the Oromo dissidents into the fold, but at the same time keeping the TPLF on board.
And maybe that's the biggest risk here, is change is always scary, and someone somewhere loses when change occurs. Yes. The power dynamics are clearly complex in Ethiopia, but how worrying is that? Because some groups will undoubtedly have benefited from the status quo for many years. Now you've got all this radical upheaval. Is there a chance that the process could be frustrated and maybe even stopped? I mean, how secure is Ahmed in his position?
Well, to be honest, the power dynamics, in as much as the army establishment closely linked to the TPLF, one has to be honest, is probably seeing some of its power eroded. Recently, heads of securities were changed in that sense, and this is not something which we've seen in as much as it's happening and unfolding. And so certainly one of the risks is some kind of a counter push to be able to arrest this. That's all I can say.
And the momentum just feels overwhelming. I mean, for years, as you said earlier, the previous government basically tried to just crack down on protests. And it feels like the country is just behind this now. This is not just about the people in power. This is also just about the population.
Yes, certainly so. And this is something which we've also seen in other places in Africa, where you have a youthful population which has said enough is enough, and we want to move beyond what has been happening in the past days. And so guess what? You have a youthful population which is on social media, which is very often very urban in that sense, which is pushing this and is demanding more in terms of services.
How big is this as a regional story, as an African story? Clearly, these are times of great change for Ethiopians, but this is also really important for East Africa and for Africa as a whole. 100 million population, it should be and will, in the next few years, become the biggest market in East Africa, and potentially could rival Nigeria as the leading market on the continent.
It is an extremely huge story. If I was an investor, I'd be putting my dollars, my euros, or my pounds into Ethiopia. I think it's a great potential, big economy. The population dynamics are great. And also with respect to the person who we have in as Prime Minister now, I earlier said he looked like a Prime Minister who was in a hurry. We have seen him now arrange a meeting between Salva Kiir Mayardit, the current president of South Sudan, and Riek Machar, who was the previous vice president. This is a meeting, we haven't seen a meeting like that for the past 2 years. And so there is movement in that sense in the region.
And this is something that many people might not appreciate, but Addis has always, from a political standpoint, been a very important hub for Pan-African issues, but also even international issues. It houses the African Union. All sorts of international activity takes place in Addis. Do you see that ramping up as you see this change sweeping through Ethiopia?
It is extremely important, and if at all we see the Ethiopian Prime Minister's recent travels and to Somalia.
We're almost
in that
out of
sense.
time, so final point on this one.
Yes, if at all we see the Prime Minister's utterances in the press, his visits to Somalia in that sense, it shows that he's taken a proactive approach to make sure that he pushes an African agenda. So certainly...
It's like he understands that Ethiopia has a responsibility beyond its own borders.
And he looks like somebody who's in a hurry to make it happen.
All right, Werner, thank you. We have really regrettably run out of time. I'd love to talk more about Ethiopia. I think it is the dark horse of African development. But thank you so much for being on The Business today. Join me in part 2 for an interview with Obi Asika, chairman of Dragon Africa. Africans have often had an awkward relationship with their own culture. Not anymore. Welcome back to this special edition of The Business, the show where we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. I'm Lanre Akinola. In this special edition, we're looking at change in Africa. Early in the series, I had the pleasure of interviewing 2 people who are very much involved in that change. In part 1, we revisit an interview I did with Werner Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit, about the big political changes and economic changes going on in Ethiopia. Obi Asika is chairman of Dragon Africa. Obi talked about a different kind of change, a change in the way Africans see themselves and their culture, and what that means for the creative industries. We've seen the Black Panther phenomenon. We've seen the Nigerian football jersey frenzy. It's been a smash hit all around the world. We've seen the rise of Afrobeat. Lai Mohammed, the Minister of Communications, has gone as far as calling the creative industries the new oil for Nigeria. What do you make of that?
We thank the minister for that. I mean, some of us have been in this thing for like 15 years, trying to drive what I call the soft power of Nigeria. And I think the soft power of Nigeria first took Africa. Now it's beginning to take the world. And it's all about engaging with the lifestyle, the culture. And it comes from a sense, from the attitude. Okay, and that attitude is an attitude of, we will win, we can win, yeah? And I think Black Panther, which is an incredible movie, I mean, I just came out of Russia from the World Cup, and they were trying to get this kit off our bodies. I don't even have the kit, but one of my friends had the tracksuit bottom. I mean, on the flight in, on the flight out, everywhere, people want Nigeria. And I think it just shows you, Nike just put in some buzz marketing and linked the football back to the lifestyle culture of our music and fashion, and bang. So obviously, it's important for people to understand that if Nike sold 3 million shirts, for example, that's 180 million pounds, right? That just shows you the value, repressed value that we have all been sitting on and not focusing on and not investing in.
So why is it starting to come through now?
Well, so a whole bunch of things. First of all, I think you have to stop the self-hate. Africans used to self-hate all the time. They wouldn't listen to their own music, they wouldn't wear their own clothes, they wouldn't drink their own drink, they wouldn't eat their own food. However, that has changed. I think every African girl around the world is wearing African designers, African fabrics and colors. We're eating the food, we have the jollof wars. So the culture has changed, the self-confidence is there, so people understand that there's value in who you are and what you do and what you bring to the table. And once you see value in yourself, then you no longer have that issue. I think that's the most important thing that changed.
Is Africa reaping the benefits of this? Because yes, we have these outstanding cases of success, the whiz kids of this world. The Jason Njokus who
Iroko doing incredibly well.
We've got these standout successes. How representative are they of the systemic structural change in the industry? Are we seeing the emergence of a broader industry, or are they actual exceptions?
Well, they're baby steps. These are outliers, right? But at the end of the day, what you see is this. Wizkid didn't just happen. He came out of a process to an extent. There was a bunch of independent labels, mine involved, many of them in Lagos maybe 10 years ago, and he was moving around. My office, a bunch of other offices and studios, and then he got through the system with Banky W and a bunch of other guys, and now he's where he's at. Davido, the same thing. But I think what you'll find is this, is that, well, we need to build a stronger companies, right? Jason's doing it the right way. quite a few others are as well. He's actually managed to raise a significant amount of cap, I think about 40 million, which is important because people need to understand and need to see that there is money in the space. We have look at Nigeria. No matter what the population is, whether it's 150 million or 200 million, it's a lot of people. And our average age of our country is about 17. So we are a youth-centric market. Every advertising company in Nigeria will talk to you about youth marketing, right? But unfortunately, most of the time, they're talking at the consumer, not with the consumer. So we have to change some of those conversations, but the opportunities are enormous.
Now, we've seen some of these successes come through. Nigeria, despite this, it's a very tough environment for any entrepreneur.
Definitely.
I mean, even if you have the money, it's an extremely difficult
It's
environment.
tough.
What needs to happen to make it, I mean, not necessarily easier, but just make it more viable for these companies to come through?
Well, I think a lot of stuff has happened between what the Bank of Industry is doing and some of those initiatives that the federal government is supporting. There are beginning to be accesses to development funds. What we haven't seen is the retail banks being able to enable equity, right? There's debt finance available, but equity is very hard to find. So I think that what we have is a situation where very few of the bankers understand content, very few of them understand media, and they take it for granted. Same thing with the politicians. But guess what? The minute they need to look for power, they come straight to media. The minute they get power, they abandon media. Then they wonder why they lose power. So for me, it's always, it doesn't make any sense. If you have no media, you have no voice, therefore you have no power. And the truth of the matter is there are no strong, really strong, very few, very strong media companies owned by black people anywhere in the world, and that's bad.
So how do you make the case when you're talking to industry leaders, when you're talking to people in government?
Well, I think the thing is, the first things first is I don't like the sort of cap in hand approach. A lot of people who are talent want to go and beg government, help us. No, don't help us. Create an enabling environment, right? Give waivers for people in this space. Enable and secure contracts. Set the film co-production treaties in place. Enable business to flow. Let's stop this whole thing like you're doing people a favor. You're not doing people a favor. You're enabling people to create more wealth. And that, I think, is a mind shift that needs to happen both for operators in the sector and for government who's trying to support the sector. And when you begin to have that conversation and begin to take it beyond the specific government at the time to a strategic approach to the sector, then I think you see much more happening.
What's your prognosis for the next few years? What needs to happen to make sure that we're getting the full potential here?
Well, I mean, like you took a segmentation. Let's look at it, for example, now. Nollywood, for example. Nigeria only has 35, 36 cinemas, so we have 150 screens. It's important to get to 1,000 screens as soon as possible. I would like to see us get back to the 1978 level, 13,000 screens. With 13,000 screens, we have the possibility to have a $4 billion Nollywood industry by itself, right? If we build venues for live events, we can build a touring circuit in Nigeria that is worth billions. The reason why Davido, Wizkid, and Flavor and all these guys are touring all the time, because they can't tour in their own country. There's no other reason. Why would you be on the plane if you can do it in Lagos? The crowd is right there in Lagos. So we've got to build the assets and the facilities and change the culture to grow the assets. News media has been news has been completely disrupted. Print is disrupted. The bloggers have disrupted the newspapers, and some of these guys need to work out how to reinvent themselves. And I think that key programming is going to be the most important thing for news media. Current affairs, proper programming that's in-depth, not superficial, will always cut through. But how you distribute it has to change.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see that news media has this influence. It's seen as this really powerful tool, but it really is struggling to attract any money. And
viewers.
You're quite right. I mean, the model is simply broken. It's simply not there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And one of the reasons it's being disrupted is social media. And one of the platforms that you've built is Social Media Week, Lagos, which is the biggest social media event in Africa. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Definitely.
What's the role of social media in all this? How has social media helped drive creative industries along? How do you think it's going to continue to reshape the media sector in general?
Well, social media affects everything, right? And, when we started 7 years ago doing Social Media Week Lagos, people thought it was a joke. You want me to come and discuss how to use WhatsApp? I said, no. It's about new media and how technology applies to your life in a connected environment. And what you suddenly work out now today is obvious to all of us, that whether it's your healthcare, whether it's your sports, whether it's your news consumption, it's all social media and it's all on the phone. Now, 10 years ago, the Europeans used to say the mobile was the third device, the third screen. We Africans always knew it was the first screen yes. Because that's where we have. So in Nigeria, you have 150 million mobile devices, less than 40 million televisions. So go mobile first as a clear strategy for the African continent. And the other thing is you've got to be talking to your people and engaging with them. Africans chat all the time. They're on every platform talking, but there's a lack of aggregation and a lack of monetization. So we're creating content, we have access, and social media has enabled access that didn't exist before for creators.
You used the key word there, monetization. How do you stop Google and Facebook taking all the money? Because certainly in the news industry, this has been the case. Like, there's been no shortage of effort to try and monetize
publishing.
social media, but it's much
It's
easier
very
said than done.
difficult. It's very difficult. I think the key thing you have to do with Google and Facebook is play them at their own game. You use their platforms to build your platform, but you enable yourself to stand alone and be able to also earn. I mean, Roku did that very well, and many others are following the same way. I mean, one of our chaps has built one of the largest, he's African, I'm not going to say his name, but he's built, literally, he's doing about 3 billion views a year on Facebook. And he's a Nigerian, he's based out of London. Very proud of him. I think in the next few months, the world will begin to learn more about him. There are many like that, and I think it's really about how people are beginning to use these things. Look at the hair and beauty channels on YouTube. All these black people with their black hair and beauty. These things are driving billions of dollars of commerce. What we need to really figure out is how do we bring some of that money back into our ecosystem? So if you're a creator and you're influencing all these people, how are you getting paid?
And we're almost out of time. Very quickly, I want to pick up on that point. What are you going to do in the next few years to make sure this happens? Because this is, I mean, you eat, sleep, breathe this stuff.
If I give away all the secrets, I would make the money.
What's your vision over the next 3 to 5 years? What needs to happen? How, where's Africa going to be in 5 years?
I think this is that moment for us as Africans. I think we have the moment now. It's not in 3 to 5 years, it's now today. And it's about coalescing and building bridges. And then once you come together and stop pushing apart the Caribbean, the North Americans, everybody, blacks, all Africans, together, one movement, global.
Obi, what a wonderful note to end the discussion on. Thank you so much for joining me on The Business Today. That's all we have time for. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of The Business.